The mist was a liar. It clung to the fields and the dark line of the forest, promising another quiet, damp morning. It muted the calls of the pre-dawn birds and swirled around the concrete edges of the small observation post, making the world feel soft and indistinct. Private Jan Kowalski, 19 years old and 3 months into his conscription, rubbed his eyes and leaned his forehead against the cold, narrow slit. The steel of his Morse rifle was soaked with condensation. Anything? A voice grunted from the shadows behind him. Nothing, just fog. Jan whispered, though he didn't know why. And trees, the same trees as yesterday. Corporal Peter Noack lit a cigarette, the flare of the match briefly illuminating his deeply lined face. He was an old man to Jan, maybe 35, a veteran of border skirmishes Jan had only read about. That's the nothing to be afraid of, boy, Peter exhaled, the smoke mingling with the mist. It's too quiet, the Germans. They aren't quiet people, not when they're planning something. Jan didn't want to believe it. He was supposed to be in Crack, studying engineering. He was supposed to be helping his father with the harvest, not sitting in a concrete box waiting for a war that the politicians in Warsaw swore would never happen. "We are strong," the radio broadcast said. "Our allies in France and Britain will stand with us." But here, on the very edge of the map, the world felt terribly thin. The silence was broken not by a sound but by a feeling. A low, thrumming vibration that came up from the earth through the soles of his boots. Jan stiffened. "Corporal, do you feel that?" Peter stamped his own boot on the packed dirt floor. His eyes went wide. "Get on the field telephone, now." Jan fumbled for the hand-cranked phone, his fingers suddenly clumsy. As he cranked the handle, the vibration in the ground was joined by a new sound from the air. It was a distant drone, like a million angry hornets. "Post 7 to Whelan Command," Jan shouted into the receiver. We hear something, engines, many of them, to the west." The voice on the other end was static-filled and panicked. "Under attack, air attack, the city is—" The line went dead with a sharp crackle. "Peter!" Jan turned, his voice cracking. "Back." The corporal was at the slit, his rifle raised. The drone became a whine. A high-pitched, terrifying shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was a sound that tore the sky apart. Jan scrambled back to his post just as the fog was ripped away, not by the sun, but by a massive concussion. A column of fire and black earth erupted from the railway line a kilometer to their south. The ground leaped, throwing Jan hard against the wall. His helmet clanged against the concrete. Then another explosion. And another. Through the ringing in his ears, Jan saw them. Dark shapes, dropping from the clouds, pulling up at the last possible second. Junkers Ju-87s. The Stukas. The dive bombers' sirens, a sound they would soon call the Jericho trumpet, wailed in a symphony of terror. They weren't aiming for the post. Not yet. They were aiming for the city of Whelan behind them, for the bridges, the rails, the barracks. They were bombing a city with no military targets, no anti-aircraft defenses. They were bombing sleeping civilians. They're bombing the city. Jan yelled, his voice thick with disbelief. "They're bombing everything," Peter roared. He pointed to the forest line, his face a mask of grim realization. The rumbling on the ground had become a clatter and a roar. As the mist dissolved, Jan saw them. They weren't men on horses. They weren't even just trucks full of infantry. Black, angular shapes. Panzer tanks. They rolled out of the trees, crushing the small wooden border gate as if it were a matchstick. There were dozens of them, their long cannons already pointing forward, their machine guns chattering with bright, winking traces. Behind them, waves of infantry in field-grey uniforms advanced, not in neat lines, but in fast-moving, dispersed squads. This wasn't a border skirmish. This wasn't a warning shot. The first machine gun rounds from the ground troops began to thwack and ping against the concrete post. Chips of stone and dust sprayed into the bunker. "Return fire." Peter bellowed. shoving a fresh clip into his rifle. "Aim for the infantry. Don't waste rounds on the Panzers. You can't stop them." Jan raised his rifle to the slit, his heart hammering so hard he could barely breathe. He tried to line up his sights on a running grey figure, but his hands were shaking. He saw a flash from the man's rifle, and a bullet screamed past the slit, so close he felt the heat of its passage. He squeezed the trigger. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, the smell of cordite filling his nostrils. The man fell. Jan felt a hot, sick bile rise in his throat. He had just... Again. Peter yelled, firing twice. "Again, boy, for Poland, hold the line." Jan chambered another round. He was an engineer. He was a son. And now he was a target. The ground shook as the first Panzer rolled past their post, ignoring them, its massive treads churning the earth, its destination set for the heart of his country. It was 4:40. The Second World War had begun. The world dissolved into noise. It was no longer a series of distinct sounds, but a single, deafening roar, the rattle of tank treads, the high-velocity snap of rifle fire, the heavier thud-thud-thud of machine guns, and the earth-shaking whomp of the Stuka's bombs landing deeper inside Poland. Dust and concrete powder filled the small bunker, making every breath a choking gasp. A bullet struck the metal plate of their observation slit, and the entire post rang like a giant cracked bell. "Keep firing," Peter yelled, his voice barely audible over the din. He was braced against the wall, firing his Mossa with a steady, practiced rhythm. "Fire and move, don't give them a clean target." Jan tried to follow. He slammed the bolt back, ejected a smoking casing, and shoved it forward, his shoulder already a dull, throbbing ache. He peered through the slit. The field grey uniforms were closer now, moving with terrifying speed. They didn't march, they sprinted from one crater to the next, firing from the hip, constantly advancing. They were a grey tide, and he and Peter were a single, crumbling rock. He aimed at a figure carrying a box of ammunition and fired. The man vanished. Jan didn't know if he'd hit him or if he just dived for cover. It didn't seem to matter. 3 more took his place. "There are too many," Jan gasped, fumbling for another stripper clip. His hands were slick with sweat. "We are not here to win, boy," Peter grunted, squeezing his trigger. "We are here to make them pay for the ground, to buy time. That is the soldier's job." A shadow fell over their post. Jan glanced up in terror, expecting a bomb, but it was one of the Panzers. It had paused, its hull swiveling, its turret rotating with a low, electric whine. The long 75mm cannon, black and menacing, swung directly towards their tiny concrete box. Jan froze. His blood turned to ice. He could see the black cross painted on the tank's side. "Peter," he whispered. Peter saw it. His face, already grim, became a mask of pure, cold realization. He didn't hesitate. "Out, test now, Jan, backhatch." Peter grabbed Jan by the collar and hauled him away from the observation slit, shoving him toward the small, steel plate that served as their rear exit. Jan's rifle clattered to the floor. "My rifle." "Forget it, Rasaj Sai, move." Peter slammed his boot against the hatch's release bar. The sound that came next was not a bang. It was a physical blow. A high explosive shell struck the front of the bunker. The concrete wall imploded. Jan was lifted from his feet and thrown against the back wall as the world became white-hot light and agonizing pressure. His ears screamed. The air was sucked from his lungs, replaced by a thick, acrid cloud of pulverized concrete and cordite. He couldn't see. He couldn't breathe. Then hands were on him, dragging him. It was Peter. The corporal was bleeding from a gash on his forehead, his uniform torn, but he was alive. He had forced the twisted metal hatch open. Get up, or you die here." Peter pulled Jan through the narrow opening and into the grey, smoky dawn. The open air was just as chaotic as the bunker. Bullets snapped through the air around them. The field they were supposed to be guarding was now a landscape from hell, churned in mud by tank treads and dotted with burning trees. The city of Whelan, 2 kilometers away, was a column of black smoke against the rising sun. "This way, to the trench line," Peter bellowed, pointing to a shallow communications trench 50 meters away that was meant to connect other posts that were now likely silent. Jan staggered to his feet. His helmet was gone. His head throbbed. He had no weapon. He just ran, his legs feeling heavy and disconnected. He heard a whoosh and a metallic crash as a bunker, the tiny post he had inhabited just moments before, was struck again. He and Peter dove headfirst into the shallow trench, landing in a muddy puddle. They were exposed behind the main German advance and utterly alone. Peter, coughing blood and mud, pressed a pistol into Jan's hand. It was his own sidearm. "No more standing still, boy," the corporal gasped, reloading his muscle-shaking hands. "From now on, we run, we hide, and we find our unit. If we don't, we fight until we can't." Jan gripped the pistol. It was heavy and cold. He was no longer a sentry. He was a survivor. And the war was just beginning. The trench was a muddy, shallow grave. It stank of damp earth and fear. "Crawl, don't run, keep your head down," Peter rasped. He had torn a strip of cloth from his undershirt and tied it around his head. It was already darkening with blood. "The ground is soft, it'll absorb the sound." Jan nodded, his throat too tight to speak. The pistol felt impossibly heavy, a cold lump of steel that bore no resemblance to the rifle he had trained on. He eased himself forward on his elbows and knees, the thick mud sucking at him. Every scrape of his boot, every click of a pebble, sounded like a gunshot in the terrifying quiet. The quiet was the new enemy. The Panzers had roared past, a wave of steel and thunder rolling towards the heart of Poland. The Stukas were bombing targets deeper in, the sirens a fading, traumatic memory. What was left was the mopping up. The infantry. Jan heard them. Shots in a harsh, guttural language German. They were fanning out across the field, their grey uniforms blending perfectly with the smoke and morning mist. A burst of machine gun fire, an MG-34, Jan recognized from his briefings, ripped through the air high above their heads, a stream of traitors stitching a line in the sky. They were firing blind, spraying the trenches, the tree lines, anywhere resistance might be hiding. "Where does this go?" Jan whispered, his lips brushing the mud. "To the secondary line, or it was supposed to." Peter coughed, a wet, rattling sound that sent a fresh spike of fear through Jan. "See those trees, the loss, the forest. 300 meters, that's our only chance. Scheibko, go, I'm behind you." Jan crawled. His world shrank to the narrow, muddy channel in front of him. His knees and elbows were raw. His lungs burnt. The shots were getting closer, moving parallel to them. A new sound joined the chaos, the thwomp of a mortar. A shell landed somewhere behind them with a wet, heavy explosion. One crack. Dirt and shrapnel rained down. Jan cried out, flattening himself against the bottom of the trench, his hands over his helmetless head. He felt a sharp sting in his calf. "They see us, they've spotted the trench, rush outside. Run, Jan, run." Peter was on his feet, shoving him. The time for stealth was over. They broke into a stumbling, crouched run. The trench was agonizingly shallow, barely high enough to cover their torsos. Jan felt naked, his back exposed to the sky, to the unseen eyes of the German machine gunners. He risked a glance behind him. Peter was lagging, his face pale and twisted in pain, one hand clutched to his side. "Peter, come on. Don't tug or don't wait for me, boy, go!" Just as Jan turned back, a figure in field grey appeared in the trench 20 meters ahead. A German soldier, no older than Jan, his face smudged with dirt. For a frozen second, they both stared, 2 young men on opposite sides of a muddy ditch, equally shocked. The German shouted a warning, a curse, Jan didn't know which. He began to raise his rifle. Jan reacted without thinking. He brought the pistol up, his arm shaking so violently he could barely aim. He pulled the trigger. Clack! The safety. The German fumbled with the bolt of his rifle. Bezbexnick, the safety, you fool! Peter roared from behind him. Jan's thumb found a small lever on the side of the pistol. He flicked it down, pointed the barrel at the center of the grey uniform, and squeezed the trigger. The bang was deafening, the recoil jarring his whole arm. He fired again. And a third time. The German soldier jerked as if punched. The rifle fell from his hands. He looked down at his chest, where dark, wet stains were spreading, then up at Jan. His eyes were wide, not with hate, but with a terrible, final surprise. He crumpled forward, his helmet clattering against the trench wall, and lay still. Jan stared, his stomach heaving. The air was thick with the smell of cordate and fresh blood. "Don't move." Peter slammed into his back, shoving him forward. "Overhand terrace." Führernschaft forced Jan to scramble, his boots slipping in the mud, right over the body of the man he had just killed. He landed hard on the other side, bile burning his throat. He didn't look back. He didn't stop. He just ran, propelled by pure animal terror. The dark line of pine trees rushed toward them. They burst from the end of the trench, tumbling through a patch of thorns and into the deep, blessed gloom of the forest. They collapsed behind a massive, moss-covered boulder, the ragged breathing the only sound. For a moment there was silence. They were hidden. They were safe. We made it," Jan panted, his entire body trembling. You did it, boy," Peter gasped. He was leaning heavily against the rock. When he tried to shift, he slid down, leaving a thick, dark smear of blood on the stone. "Peter?" Jan's relief vanished. The corporal was clutching his side, his tunic soaked through. It wasn't just the head wound. The mortar shell. A piece of shrapnel. No, Peter, no." Jan scrambled to him, his hands hovering, not knowing what to do. Peter looked up, his eyes already clouded, his skin a waxy gray. Listen to me, Jan," he wheezed, grabbing Jan's shirt with a surprisingly strong grip. "Forget the secondary line, it's gone. They're too fast. We have to stop the bleeding." Jan cried, looking wildly for field dressing. Too late for that, Peter coughed, a spray of red misting Jan's face. You find the 28th Regiment there, at the water river. Tell them the Panzers, they're not stopping for anything, tell them." His voice trailed off into a wet rattle. "Tell them what, Peter, stay awake, Tosten." The corporal's grip tightened. His eyes found Jan's and held them. Don't die for nothing, make it count, Jan, Resumus, make it count." His hand went limp. His head lolled to the side. Jan stared at the blood on his hands, at the pistol still gripped in his right, at the dead man who had, for a few hours, been his only guide. He was 19 years old. He was alone in a forest swarming with the enemy. The war was 4 hours old, and he had just learned how to kill. Silence. The forest floor was damp with a mixture of dew and mist, and it swallowed all sound. For a full minute Jan did not move. He only stared at the corporal's slack-jawed face, at the spreading stain of blood that soaked the pine needles beneath him. The contrast between the hellish noise of a past hour and the funereal quiet of this moment was a new kind of torture. Peter, who had been a veteran, a guide, a rock, was gone, and the war had barely drawn its first breath. A cold, sharp wave of adrenaline, purer and colder than the terror he'd felt before, cut through Jan's shock. Make it count. His hands, still trembling, moved to Peter's body. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry, Corporal." His fingers fumbled with the clasp on Peter's ammunition belt. He pulled it free and buckled it around his own thin waist. It was heavy, laden with 5 round clips for the Mauser. Then his hand rested on the rifle still clutched in Peter's grip. He had to tug to free it from the man's squealing fingers. He was a ghoul. He was a soldier. Pistol in his belt, rifle in his hands, Jan now had 2 weapons and a full load of ammunition. He was no longer a victim. He was a threat. A sudden burst of shouts in German snapped him to his feet. Dort ein Bloodspot, a blood trail shell. They had found the trench. They were following Peter's blood. Jan didn't look back at the body. He couldn't. He plunged deeper into the forest, his lights pumping, his wounded calf screaming in protest. He ran, not with a plan, but with the pure, driven instinct of prey. He dodged low-hanging branches that whipped his face, vaulted over fallen logs, and his boots slipped on the bed of wet pine needles. The trees were a blur of green and brown. The air in his lungs felt like it was full of broken glass. Behind him, he heard them. They were in the woods now, fanning out. In this direction, fewer. A shot cracked through the trees. The bullet thwacked into a trunk just to Jan's left, sending a spray of bark and splinters into his cheek. He cried out and stumbled, crashing through a thicket of ferns and rolling down a short, steep embankment. He landed hard on a muddy creek bed, the icy water shocking his system. He lay there, half submerged, gasping for air, his heart threatening to burst from his chest. He listened. The shouts were further away now, and moving past his position. They had followed his main path, not his tumble down the bank. He had, by pure, clumsy luck, evaded them. Jan stayed in the freezing water for what felt like an hour, every nerve screaming. He was shaking so violently his teeth chattered, a rhythmic clack-clack-clack that seemed loud enough to give him away. Slowly, agonizingly, he pulled himself out of the creek and crawled into a dense patch of undergrowth. He was soaked. He was bleeding. He was alone. He lay on his stomach, the wet leaves cold against his face, and forced himself to think. Peter's words. Water River. 28th Regiment. The Water River. That was kilometers. 10. 20. He had no map. He had no compass. He looked up through the canopy of pine boughs. The sky was brighter now, a uniform, oppressive grey. The smoke from Whelan was a thick, dark pillar to the south. But to the east, the clouds were just slightly thinner, a paler grey. The sun was there. East. He had to go east. Jan checked the rifle. He slid the bolt back, a round was chambered. He flipped the safety on. He looked at his leg. The trouser was torn, and the gash in his calf was oozing dark blood into the mud. It was stiffening, the pain a deep, constant throb. Make it count. He ripped another strip from his already torn shirt and bound it tightly around his calf, wincing as he pulled the knot tight. It was a poor bandage, but it was something. Pushing himself to his feet, Jan used the rifle as a crutch. Every instinct screamed at him to stay hidden, to curl up and wait for this nightmare to end. But Peter's voice was in his head. He took one step, then another. He was a single, wounded, 19-year-old soldier, deep inside enemy-occupied territory. He began his long, painful walk toward the rising sun, toward a river he could only hope to find. The forest was a green, indifferent ocean. Jan waded through it, his progress agonizingly slow. Each step was a fresh betrayal. His makeshift bandage was already soaked through, and the throb in his calf had sharpened to a biting, rhythmic agony that matched his heartbeat. He leaned heavily on the mortar, using it as a third leg. The pine needles and damp earth muffled his footsteps, but every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of panic through his system. He was hunting, and he was being hunted. For hours he moved east. He had no plan other than to put distance between himself and the border, to move toward the imaginary line of the Water River. The sun, a pale disk in the overcast sky, was his only guide. The distant rumble of the invasion had become a constant, low-frequency hum on the edge of his hearing, the sound of a world being torn apart. He was thirsty. His mouth was dry and sticky, coated with the metallic taste of fear. His stomach, which had violently emptied itself after he'd killed a German soldier, now felt like a cold, hollow knot. Late in the afternoon he guessed the trees began to thin. The constant, mechanical grinding grew louder, resolving into distinct sounds: the roar of engines, the clatter of treads, the shouting of many men. Jan dropped to his stomach, the wet leaves cooled against his shirt. He crawled the last 20 meters to the edge of the forest, parting a fern with a shaking hand. He looked down, and the lust of his hope drained away. It was a main road. It was a road. And it was no longer Poland's. It was a river of steel and field grey, flowing east. It was an endless and broken column. He saw Panthers, their long cannons casting afternoon shadows. He saw Opel Blitz trucks, their canvas tops hiding the scores of infantry packed inside. He saw half-tracks towing cannons, motorcycles with sidecars zipping along the grassy verges, and officers in peaked caps studying maps spread on the hoods of staff cars. It wasn't a column. It was a serpent, and its tail was still deep in Germany. They were not fighting. They were advancing. They moved with an unhurried, mechanical, terrifying confidence. This wasn't the chaotic skirmish he had survived, this was a machine. Jan lay frozen, his breath fogging the leaves in front of him. He realized the terrifying truth Peter hadn't understood. The generals in Warsaw hadn't understood. This wasn't a war they could fight in trenches. The enemy was already behind them, beside them, and in front of them. The front line he was trying to reach probably didn't exist anymore. It had been punctured in 1,000 places, dissolved in the first hours of the morning. He watched as a squad of infantry fell out of line by the roadside, just 100 meters from his hiding place. They laughed, smoking cigarettes and opening tins of food, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. They were not worried. They were conquerors. One of them, a young man with blonde hair, walked toward the edge of the trees to relieve himself. He unbuttoned his tunic, humming a tune. Jan's hand tightened on his rifle. The sights lined up perfectly on the man's chest. It was an easy shot. One less. He felt a cold, reptilian hatred rise in him, pushing past the fear. He could do it. He could kill another one. His finger brushed the trigger. Make it count. Was this counting? Killing one man here, only to be found and torn apart by the 100 others he could see? No. This would be a pointless, suicidal gesture. This would be dying for nothing. Jan slowly, agonizingly, lowered the rifle. He exhaled a breath he felt he had been holding since dawn. The soldier finished, buttoned his trousers, and rejoined his comrades, oblivious to the fact that his life had just been spared by a 19-year-old boy in the bushes. Jan knew now. He couldn't cross the road. He couldn't even get near it. His only hope was to stay within the forest, to move parallel to the steel serpent, to become a ghost in his own country. He had to travel east, but he had to do it while shadow dancing a fully mobilized army. He pulled back from the tree line, deeper into the darkness of the woods. The pain in his leg was a white-hot scream. His thirst was a fire in his throat. He was no longer a soldier trying to find his regiment. He was just a boy, lost in a forest that was now enemy territory, trying to survive until the next sunrise. The sun, which had been a reluctant ally, began to abandon him. It dipped below the western horizon, not in a blaze of glory, but in a slow, seeping bleed of bruised purple and sickly orange that silhouetted the pines. With the light went the last of the day's meager warmth. A damp, penetrating cold rose from the forest floor, clinging to his soaked uniform and turning his shivering from a tremor to a violent, uncontrollable shudder. Darkness in the forest was absolute. It was an oppressive, tangible blackness that smothered the world. Jan, who had walked these same woods on childhood hunting trips, found himself utterly blind. He couldn't see the hand in front of his face, let alone the trees he kept walking into. He stumbled, his foot catching on an unseen root. He fell hard, his bad leg twisting beneath him. A raw, involuntary scream tore from his throat. The pain was no longer a throb, it was a flash of white-hot lightning that shot from his calf to his hip. He lay on the damp earth, panting, tears of agony and frustration streaming down his face, carving clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. He was done. He couldn't go on. He could just lie here. He could close his eyes. It would be so easy to let the cold take him, to let the pain fade into peaceful numbness. It would be an end. Make it count. Peter's voice again. Guttural. Insistent. Dying here in the mud is not counting. With a groan that was half-sob, Jan forced himself into a sitting position. He fumbled in his pocket, his numb fingers searching for his lighter. His father had given it to him. An engineer always needs a flame. His thumb flicked the wheel. Once. Twice. On the third try, a tiny, precious flame sparked to life. In its flickering glow, he inspected his leg. The sight of it made his stomach lurch again. The trouser leg was stiff with dried and fresh blood. The bandage he detied was a filthy, sodden rag. He carefully untied the knot, hissing as the cloth peeled away, sticking to the wound. The gash was deep. The flesh around it was puffy and angry red, and the edges were caked with mud and bits of leaf. It was already beginning to fester. He knew what he had to do. He'd seen his father do it once to a gold hunting dog. Gritting his teeth so hard his jaw ached, Jan took Peter's pistol from his belt. He clicked the safety off. He pointed the barrel at a patch of bare dirt and pulled the trigger. The bang was colossal in the silent woods. It echoed like a cannon shot, a thunderclap of his own making. For a terrifying second, he was sure he had just signed his own death warrant. He held his breath, listening. Far away, on the road, he heard a few shouts, but they were distant, unconcerned. A single gunshot in a forest at war? It was nothing. A nervous sentry. A stray animal. The pistol's barrel smoked. Jan flicked the lighter again. He held the flame under the muzzle of the gun, heating the metal until it was nearly glowing. He could smell the burning oil. "Forgive me, Odgs," he whispered. He pressed the searing hot metal of the pistol barrel directly into the open wound. His world exploded. He didn't scream, he bellowed a choked, inhuman sound that was ripped from his very soul. The smell of his own burning flesh filled his nostrils. Black spots danced in his vision, and he very nearly passed out. But he held it there. 1 second. 2. 3. Then he collapsed backward, the pistol falling from his spasming grip. He lay panting, sick with a new, cold sweat, the world spinning around him. The pain was now a vast, cauterized, unholy thing. But the bleeding had stopped. He lay there for a long time, drifting on the edge of consciousness. The sounds of the German column provided a hellish lullaby, the distant grind of tank treads, a snatch of a harmonica, the rumble of supply trucks that would continue all night without end. They were so confident. They hadn't even stopped for the darkness. They were a machine that did not sleep. But I'm not dead. Slowly, painfully, Jan sat up. He tore a fresh, clean strip of cloth from the hem of his tunic, the last clean piece he had, and bound the burn. It was clumsy work in the dark, but it was done. He couldn't walk. Not now. Not tonight. He crawled, dragging his useless leg, until he found a refuge, the upturned roots of a massive, fallen spruce. It formed a shallow cave, a hollow space shielded from the wind by a curtain of roots and earth. He dragged himself into the cramped, dark space. He was cold. He was starving. His leg felt like it was on fire. He checked his rifle, placing it beside him. He took the pistol, clicked the safety back on, and held it to his chest. He was a wounded animal in a burrow, waiting for the hunters to pass. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to wait for the sun. The first day was over. He had survived. Sleep was impossible. It was not a refuge he could seek, but a dark, treacherous pool he had to fight. To sleep, he knew, might be to die. The cold was a physical weight, pressing him into the damp earth, and his cauterized leg throbbed with a dull, sickening pulse that was a constant, screaming reminder of his new reality. He drifted, instead, in a half-conscious fever dream. He saw his mother's kitchen, smelled the sharp, comforting scent of drying herbs and baking bread. He saw his father's hands calloused and strong, fixing a broken gear. He saw the lecture hall and crack, a vast room he would never sit in, its chalkboard covered in equations he would never solve. Then the images would curdle. The German soldier's face, eyes wide with that awful, final surprise, would flash before him. He would see Peter sliding down the bloody rock. He would feel the hot metal of the pistol against his own flesh, and he'd jerk awake, gasping, his hand flying to the pistol he still held. Each time the world would reassert itself, the cramped darkness of the rude cave, the musty smell of earth and decay, and the unending, mechanical groan of the German advance. The night was a symphony of enemy sounds. The column on the road never stopped. He heard the clatter-clank squeal of tank treads, the low rumble of trucks in low gear, the occasional high-pitched whine of a motorcycle. He heard men singing, their voices carrying on the cold air a boisterous, confident sound that made his stomach clench with hatred. They were in his country, on his roads, singing songs of home, while he was hiding in the dirt like a rat. Some time before dawn, the thirst became an obsession. It was worse than the hunger, worse even than the cold. His tongue felt thick and dry, his throat raw. He licked the damp earth of the burrow, gagging on the taste of mud and rot, but it was all there was. Finally, after an eternity of shivering and pain, he saw it. A faint, grey, almost imperceptible shift in the blackness. The air grew thinner, colder. Dawn. He waited until the forest was no longer a collection of shadows but had resolved back into individual trees. He heard a bird's single, brave chirrup. Then another. The sounds of the forest were trying to re-establish themselves against the mechanical din from the road. With a groan, Jan dragged himself from the burrow. The morning light was merciless. He looked and felt like a creature dug up from a grave. He was caked in mud, his face was scratched and bruised, his uniform was a torn, bloody rag. He looked at his leg. The burn was a hideous, blackened crater, weeping a clear, watery fluid at its edges. The skin around it was an angry, swollen purple. But it was sealed. He had stopped the bleeding. He tried to put weight on it. The pain was so immediate and so blinding that he collapsed against the tree roots, his vision graying at the edges. He couldn't walk. Not on that. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. If he couldn't walk, he would be found. He would die here. He looked at the Mauser. It wasn't just a rifle. It was a crutch. He took a deep breath, shoved the rifle butt into the soft earth, and used it to hold himself upright. He stood on his one good leg, the other held agonizingly off the ground. He could move. He could lurch. He could hop. It would be slow. It would be agony. But it was not impossible. First, water. He had to have water. He remembered the creek he had fallen into yesterday. It was downhill, back the way he had come back toward the German sweep. It was a terrible risk. But his body was screaming for water. He began to move, a grotesque, three-legged shamble through the undergrowth. He moved from tree to tree, leaning on one, then hopping to the next, using the rifle to balance. Every jolt sent fire up his leg. He found a creek. It was a shallow, muddy stream, but the water was clear and cold. He fell on his stomach at the bank and plunged his entire head into the stream, drinking in huge, greedy, painful gulps. The icy water was the best thing he had ever tasted. It was life. He drank until his stomach ached, then splashed the water on his face, washing away the dried blood and tears. He refilled his canteen. He was alive. He had survived the night. A voice, sharp and close, cut through the air. "Hans, Sie da, das, and Hans, look at this." Jan froze. His head snapped up. On the other side of the creek, Not 30 meters away stood 2 German soldiers. They were not the confident troops from the road. They were infantry, haggard and mud-stained, part of the sweep. And they were looking right at him. For a frozen, heart-stopping second, nobody moved. Jan was half in, half out of the creek, his Mauser rifle lying on the bank just beyond his reach. The 2 German soldiers stood on the opposite bank, their own rifles slung over their shoulders, their expressions a mixture of surprise and sudden, predatory alertness. They hadn't expected to find anyone. The taller one, with a face like a hawk, was the first to react. He barked a command H&E hawk, hands up, and simultaneously unslung his MP-40 submachine gun. The other soldier, younger, with wide, nervous eyes, fumbled to bring his own Kar 98 rifle to bear. Jan didn't think. He didn't plan. He acted. He was a wounded animal, and they were the hunters. He roared a sound of pure, unadulterated rage and terror and lunged, not for his rifle, but for the water. He threw himself sideways, back into the shallow creek, just as the hawk-faced soldier opened fire. The 9mm rounds tore the air where Jan had been a split second before. Geysers of water and mud erupted around him. The sound was deafening, a brutal, mechanical ripping. A bullet slid across his shoulder, a white-hot poker that felt like a hornet's sting, but he barely registered it. He was submerged, crawling frantically through the mud and rocks of the creek bed, the current pulling at him. The water was his only cover. Ist im Wasser, he's in the water, fire, the German shouted. The younger soldier fired his rifle. The crack was sharp, and the heavy round whacked into the water somewhere near Jan's submerged legs. Jan couldn't stay down. His lungs were bursting. He burst from the surface, gasping 10 meters downstream, hidden for a moment by a low-hanging willow branch. The hawk-faced soldier was already moving, running along the bank to cut him off, spraying the water in short, controlled bursts. Jan saw his Mauser, still lying on the bank where he'd left it. It was too far. But Peter's pistol was still jammed in his belt. With a desperate, clumsy lurch, Jan grabbed the pistol, his hands slick with mud and water. He thumbed off the safety. He was half lying in the stream, his bed leg a useless, burning anchor. He braced his firing arm on a mossy rock. The younger soldier had knelt on the opposite bank to take careful aim. He was silhouetted against the grey morning sky. Jan didn't aim. He pointed. He fired. The bang from the pistol was flat and wet. The soldier grunted a sound of surprise and clutched his chest. He looked down, then back at Jan, his mouth open. He toppled forward into the mud. "Karl!" the hawk-faced soldier screamed, his voice cracking with rage. He stopped running and brought the MP-40 around, leveling it directly at Jan's head. Jan tried to fire again, but the pistol clicked on an empty chamber. He had used his last rounds. He stared down the black, unblinking eye of the submachine gun's muzzle. This was it. Click. The German's gun was also empty. He had fired his whole magazine into the water. They were 30 meters apart. 2 men, both with useless weapons, staring at each other across a creek, one's friend lying dead in the mud. The German soldier growled a curse. He didn't hesitate. He dropped the empty MP-40, it was on a sling, and pulled a potato masher grenade from his belt. With a practiced motion, he twisted the cap at the base of the handle. Jan's blood ran cold. He had no bullets. He couldn't run. The soldier reared back, his arm ready to throw. Jan did the only thing he could. He grabbed his Mauser rifle from the bank, not to fire it, but to stand. He used it as a crutch, hauling his screaming, wounded body to its feet. He stood, exposed, covered in mud and blood, and stared at the German, a silent, defiant target. The German paused. His arm was cocked. He saw Jan's leg. He saw the burned, blackened flesh. He saw the boy, trembling with pain and exhaustion, yet still standing. For a long, agonizing moment the German held the pose, the live grenade in his hand. He was an executioner. Jan was a dead man. Then, with a snarl of contempt, or was it something else? Disgust? Pity? The soldier lowered his arm. He spat into the creek. He gave one last look at his dead comrade, Karl, then at Jan. He turned his back on Jan and walked away, disappearing into the trees, leaving Jan alone with the dead man. Jan stood there, shaking, the useless pistol in one hand, the rifle in the other. He didn't understand. He should be dead. Why had the soldier spared him? He didn't have time to ponder it. He had to move. He had just killed another man. The German had left, but he would be back, and he would bring more. Jan grabbed the dead soldier's rifle, a Kar-98, identical to his own Moser, and, more importantly, the 2 full ammunition pouches from his belt. He didn't look at the young man's face. He couldn't. He was rearmed. He was wounded. And he was being hunted again. He limped out of the creek and vanished back into the forest, leaving 2 bodies to mark the start of his second day. Jan didn't run. He couldn't. He shambled, he lurched, he fell and dragged himself back up. His world was a smear of green and brown, seen through a haze of pain. The new wound in his shoulder was a searing, superficial burn, a red-hot line of fire where the bullet had grazed him. But his leg was a catastrophe. The cauterized wound had been torn open in the scramble, and the icy water of the creek had done nothing to numb the deep, agonizing throb. He was leaving a trail of blood, of muddy water, of broken branches. He was a wounded stag, and the wolves were coming. He pushed deeper into the woods, his direction no longer a calculated move east, but a frantic, blind flight away from the creek. Every 10 steps he had to stop, leaning against a tree, his lungs heaving, his body sick with sweat despite the morning chill. His mind was a battlefield as chaotic as the one he fled. Why? The question echoed with every painful heartbeat. Why didn't he kill me? He saw the German soldier's face again, the snarl, the contempt. It wasn't pity. Jan was sure of that. It was something else. Was he so broken, so pathetic, that he wasn't even worth a grenade? Was he no longer a soldier, but just a piece of human refused to be left to die in the woods? The thought was a new kind of violation. It was worse than being shot at. It was a complete and total dismissal. You are not a threat. You are not even worth the effort of killing. A fresh, cold rage, different from the hot terror, solidified in his gut. It was a small, hard ember. I am not dead. I am not nothing. He forced himself onward. He found the thicket of blackberry bushes, a thorny, impenetrable wall of green. Painfully he tore his way into the middle of it, ignoring the thorns that ripped at his skin and uniform. He crawled into the darkest part and collapsed, his back against the earth, the thorny branches forming a natural cage around him. He was hidden. He was for a moment safe. He immediately checked his weapons. He reloaded Peter's pistol with ammunition from the dead German's pouches. He checked the action of the new rifle. It was a standard Kar-98, almost identical to his Polish Moser. He now had 2 rifles and a pistol, and more ammunition than he did since the war began. He was a walking, wounded arsenal. He lay there, panting, and listened. It didn't take long. He heard them. Shouts. Not just 2 men, but a squad. They were organized. They were sweeping the woods from the creek. He heard the crash of boots, the sharp, clipped orders in German. They were close. Jan raised the rifle, his hand shaking so badly he could barely hold it steady. He pointed it in the direction of the sounds, his finger resting on the trigger. He was in a cage of thorns, a cornered animal. If they found him, he would take 1 and 0, 2 with him. He would make it count. He held his breath. The shouting grew louder past his position and then began to fade. They had missed him. His bloody trail, mixed with the creek water and the forest's damp floor, had been lost. They had swept past his hiding place. Jan let his head fall back against the dirt, his eyes closing, his entire body trembling with the aftershock of adrenaline. He was alone again. He stayed in the thorny burrow for hours, not moving, drifting in and out of a feverish, painful doze. The sun moved across the sky, its light tapping through the leaves, promising an afternoon he had not expected to see. He was alive, but he was trapped, and the German army was all around him. The afternoon was a fevered dream. Trapped in his thorny cage, Jan drifted between agonizing consciousness and a fitful, delirious sleep. The pain from his leg was no longer a sharp, clean burst. It was a deep, rotting, heavy throb that seemed to bone deep. His body was on fire. He licked the moisture from the leaves around him, but it did nothing to quench the raging thirst. He knew, with the detached clarity of an engineer studying a failing machine, that his body was breaking. The wound, cauterized and then ripped open and soaked in muddy creek water, was infected. If he stayed here, he wouldn't be found by the Germans. He would be found by death, consumed by the fever. He had been spared by the soldier only to be killed by his own body. The irony was a bitter pill. That German, the one who had snarled at him, hadn't granted him mercy. He had handed him a slower, more painful sentence. No. The small, hard ember of rage in his gut flared. I will not die in a bush. He would not give that soldier the satisfaction of being right. He was not nothing. As the afternoon light began to soften, turning from harsh white to a warmer gold, Jan forced himself to move. Every motion was a fresh agony, the thorns tearing at him as he backed out of the thicket. He emerged into the cooling forest air, a grotesque figure caked in blood and mud. He leaned against a tree, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He had to think. Not as prey, but as a soldier. First, wounds. He couldn't cauterize it again. He tore the last clean strips from the tail of his ruined tunic. He poured a small amount of precious water from his canteen onto the cloth and, wincing, scrubbed the wound clean of dirt and crusted blood. It was a hideous, puffy mess. He bandaged it tightly, the pressure and new, sickening pain. Second, wait. He looked at the weapons at his feet. 2 rifles, 1 pistol, and pouches heavy with ammunition. He was a walking arsenal, but he could barely walk. He was too heavy. He made a painful choice. He laid down the rifle he had taken from the dead German Karl. It felt wrong, like a betrayal. But he kept its ammunition pouches, stuffing the stripper clips into his own pockets until they bulged. He kept Peter's pistol jammed in his belt. And he kept his own Moser, the one Peter had thrust back at him. It was his crutch. It was his only companion. Third direction. The sun was beginning to dip, painting the western sky. East was now clear. The Water River. The 28th Regiment. Peter's last order. It was no longer a desperate hope, it was his only mission. It was the only thing keeping him from lying down to die. He waited for dusk, the period the soldiers called the grey. The light was dim, the shadows long. The endless, grinding noise from the main road was still there, a constant, hateful reminder. He would have to move parallel to it, staying deep enough in the woods to be invisible, but close enough to use the road as a guide. He drank the last of his water. It wasn't enough, but it would have to be. He pushed himself off the tree, his newly bandaged legs screaming. He ignored it. He locked the pain in a box in his mind. Make it count. He began to move. A slow, agonizing, three-legged limp through the descending darkness. He was no longer Jan Kowalski, the engineering student. He was a ghost, haunted by the men he had killed and the men who had let him live, moving through a forest that was no longer his.